Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar. I was watching the participants come in. I think we'll have about 30 maybe joining us today if everybody can get their schedules arranged the way they think to join us as for a webinar in the middle of the day. I see lots of familiar names, so hello to you, to those of you that I know. I see a bunch of new names. There's a big crowd from where Dean works. I'm not sure if you work with Dean and you're attending to support him, or you work for Dean and maybe you've been ordered to attend. We'll see. But welcome. I am Beth Schaefer. I'm the director of the Institute for Professional Development at Metro State. We deliver the continuing education, customized training, non-credit certificates for the university. One of our areas of specialty is business architecture. And we have one built out certificate course, one of two in the US, and we hope to start offering that in person again next spring. And we are still hopeful that we will have our new virtual version of that course ready to offer this fall. We have some more expert insights coming up this summer related to business architecture. And as those come out, we will be revealing more information. So hopefully by the end of July, we will have made decisions and have dates ready for you to enroll. Between now and then, we'll continue to collect customer input. As soon as that course is finished, we hope to begin designing other courses. We're calling them, for the moment, mastery courses, where we would focus in on specific tools or specific uses like mergers and acquisitions for business architecture. And so we'll be looking for your input. Since we can't do everything all at once, we're hoping you can prioritize and tell us what you're interested in learning more about. I want to also mention that today's session is being recorded and it will be posted later on our website. So if you're not interested in being recorded, this is your chance to hop out, although you won't be seen. But still, some people are, I respect whatever your decision is. So today's talk by Dean also assumes that you have some base knowledge of business architecture. So if you have no idea what business architecture is, you're welcome to stay on. Not sure how useful you'll find the session, but like I said, you're welcome to stay on. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to Dean Heltemus. Dean is an instructor for us in business architecture, but he is a full-time business architect, and he has been active in the Twin Cities business architecture scene for quite a while. And I'm going to turn it over to Dean, and he can give you a little more about his background. Oh, sorry, one more thing before I go. We will be taking questions through chat about halfway through. So as you have questions, throw them into the chat and I'll get them fed to Dean at the halfway point, and then we'll do that again at the end of the session. So feel free to interact with us through the chat. All right, Dean, you are up.
All right, thanks, Beth. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Dean Heltemus. Thrilled to be with you here today. Today's session titled Business Architecture at the Speed of Business. Around a year ago, I did a similar session. Obviously, at that point, we were in the middle of the beginnings of the pandemic, and we were just starting to think about what life was going to be like as things were changing all around us. And so now a year later, it's kind of interesting to reflect back as to what has changed. And in particular, I think many of us have seen just that pace of change really go through the roof over the last year. And so going to be spending quite a bit of time kind of reflecting a bit on what we've been seeing. Give some good examples, hopefully, that you can relate to. But then on top of that, then kind of dig a little bit deeper into the business architecture toolbox for some ideas of how maybe you can use either new tools or some existing tools a little bit differently. So again, a little bit about me. I've been in the IT field for, I guess, well over 25 years now. And for quite a bit of that, probably a third of that in an architecture role. I've been in almost every aspect of architecture as a solution architect, enterprise architect, but business architecture is my passion. I've been doing that for quite a while now. In my day job, I work at Ameriprise Financial as a business architect and have just started over the last year working with Metro State. Another fun fact about myself is my wife and I do run a small business. And so quite often I find some really good analogies and some stories from the running of a small business as well. And I'll refer to those a few times today in the presentation. So let's start a little bit by digging into the changing business environment. So it's a pretty well-known fact that businesses that fail to adapt fail. And so a few long-term examples here that I think most people are familiar with, and some newer ones. So I think the most storied example of a business that failed to adapt probably is Blockbuster. I think many of us grew up where Blockbuster was king. Movie rentals, and had the world at their fingertips. But a couple competitors came along with a whole new business model, and Blockbuster just simply didn't adapt in time. And so Netflix in particular, with their getting movies by mail, and then shortly thereafter Redbox came along, and sure enough, Blockbuster did attempt to adapt to some of those models, but they didn't do it fast enough, and Blockbuster fairly quickly then folded. Another similar long-term example is Kodak. Obviously, Kodak kind of pioneered photography, but today Kodak's not. I'm not even sure, honestly, if they're even around anymore. But certainly not at the top of that list. So two obvious examples of companies that failed to adapt. BlackBerry. Pretty sure none of you are walking around with your BlackBerries today. So another obvious example. MySpace has all but disappeared. But there's some newer ones on this list. So, let's start with Toys R Us. I think many of us grew up with Toys R Us being one of our favorite stores to go visit. And so where did Toys R Us go wrong? It's not necessarily that they went wrong, but they basically got outflanked at doing what they do, by other companies better. So in particular, the big box stores, Walmart, Target, then add Amazon to that list. They started offering toys at in many cases a better price point, and then certainly the ability to get them online. And all of a sudden people started realizing, why do I need to go to a different store to shop for toys? You look over the last year, ordering toys via the mail, sure enough, Toys R Us just couldn't compete. Now, I believe there is still some semblance of Toys R Us out there, but I think they're going to have it, kind of a tough road ahead of them, based on their core business model today. Pier 1 Imports is another similar example. Again, Pier 1's been around for a long time, had been quite a successful company, but over the last year, they did declare bankruptcy. They did kind of shut down all of their stores. So again, what went wrong with Pier 1? The primary thing again is new digital entrants came along with the big box stores, and started doing exactly what Pier 1 did, but albeit a little bit better. A good example is Wayfair. So I think I personally have ordered things from Wayfair as well. Quite often you can go to big box stores and get what you could at Pier 1. So there just wasn't a differentiating proposition to go to Pier 1. Interestingly enough, Pier 1 actually has now kind of resurfaced, looking to add kind of just an online store presence where you can still go and order stuff from Pier 1. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to be more successful than some of the things they've done in the past, because again, all these other companies are still there. So I think the point of this is, I think everyone again recognizes that you can be successful one year and be out of business the next year. And so the ability to adapt quickly is absolutely critical in the ever-changing marketplaces we have today. Let's reflect back on kind of what happened over the last year. So I think all of us in the businesses we work in, had to react to what occurred with the COVID-19 pandemic. It really forced companies to react quickly. And in most cases, what happened is strategies got put on hold for tactics, right? So for business architects, that can be a tough road, right? Is we spend a lot of time in strategic planning, working with our business partners on prioritizing where you go next. All of a sudden, all of your best laid plans probably got put on the shelf, and tactical decisions had to be made. Many companies were forced to collaborate very quickly to solve some real world problems to just stay in business. The best example is the global supply chain issues. So as different countries shut down, all of a sudden, global exports were impacted. Well, in a global economy like we have, that can be very difficult for many of our companies to deal with. And so all of a sudden they found themselves not having the luxury of spending months or years trying to figure out who should they be partnering with. They were forced to very quickly kind of just go out and find other options and alternatives. And some companies got really creative and were quite successful at that. We'll talk about a few of those in a minute here. The other big one is digital transformation plans were accelerated. So all of a sudden, when foot traffic disappears to sites, what happens? You go to websites. And so the good news is most companies have already started down this path, but clearly the events of 2020 have accelerated many of those digital transformation plans to get something out there. And in most cases, just to keep them up and running. So let's talk about some of the companies that were adapted pretty well in 2020. And this is just a small list. I'm sure there's many other examples out there. But since we're conducting this session today on Zoom, I think it's an interesting one to start with. So Zoom was out there. Zoom existed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but I'd argue most people really hadn't even heard of it. If you go back in the older days of teleconferencing and webinars, I think many other companies had the market share, and Zoom was kind of a new entrant. Well, all of a sudden, Zoom became a household word overnight. They literally scaled from 10 million to 300 million users in a very short time frame. Now, it didn't all go well. Clearly, they were in the news, and they definitely had some issues from security, some outages. But today, Zoom literally is a verb, right, that people use much more frequently than any of the other technologies in the space. So they really capitalized on what happened over the last year, and were able to, largely because of their ability to scale up quickly. Another very different example is the Home Depot. So some people don't know this, but the Home Depot actually makes a good portion of their revenue from working with professionals and contractors. So yes, many of us go to Home Depot all the time, but that's just a part of their business. Well, when quarantines and lockdowns went in, a lot of that building actually was put on hold. But what did pop up was kind of a new trend in do-it-yourself. Beth, who's on the phone with us today, was just talking about she's in her basement right now, laying a new floor. Many people started actually, now that they had time, digging in and saying, what am I going to do around my house? And so they wholeheartedly kind of switched their marketing efforts to really go for the do-it-yourselfer. And we're able to, again, be able to kind of refunnel and pivot a bit on their focus. And we're able to, kind of capitalize on that. A number of kind of engineering firms were able to kind of help out in a couple of ways. One was, there was a dramatic need for everything from, COVID-19 testing, diagnostics, to much of the equipment that was needed to help people out who were suffering through COVID. And Thermo Fisher Scientific is one great example that pivoted and actually, increased revenues dramatically in that space. And there's a number of other companies. So just firms that were able to see, a niche need that now hasn't become so niche. It's probably something they're going to be using in the future. But they saw that they didn't have years to kind of plan for that. They had to make some very quick decisions, and that paid off not only to help all of us, right, as people had to deal with this healthcare crisis, but also to build something that they can build a business model around into the future. Home baking trend, right? So all of a sudden people are at home, people are cooking, and so Hershey, as they saw many segments of their marketplace start to go down, what they did see is a dramatic increase in home baking. And so what they saw was, in particular, chocolate chips. I think their chocolate chip sales went through the roof. And so again, their ability to manage their supply chain, their ability to kind of refocus marketing efforts, they were able to take, and just refunnel resources in a different way to kind of keep themselves up and running. Another really kind of brand new and interesting trend was what happened with movies. And so, I think early on in the pandemic, there were a few examples of companies that said, I'm still going to release my movies to theaters, even though Only a very small percentage were open, and every single one of those was a failure, right? There just wasn't enough foot traffic into theaters to make that worthwhile. Disney really decided a different path, which is, they had launched their Disney Plus streaming service. It's been quite successful. They said, let's give this a shot. Let's release Mulan at a fee on their platform. And it worked. I mean, it wasn't, probably they wouldn't make as much as they did at theaters, but, it was a model that actually worked for them. And, we saw some other examples where a number of movies have come out both in theaters and then in parallel, say on the HBO Max streaming service. So that's a whole new thing that really didn't exist before. And as we move forward, think about, is that going to go away or is that going to stick around? I think you'll see there, and probably agree, many of those things probably are going to stick around because now that we got used to them, there's really some good opportunities to be made for companies that can do that. Phillips Distilling is an alcohol company local here in Minnesota, and many other companies like that also saw an opportunity to help out, right? Where there was a mass shortage on hand sanitizer. They had the lines, they had the capacity. They actually started making hand sanitizer. And so I'm not sure they made a bunch of money on that, but it's certainly good press, certainly good publicity for them. And they were able to help out in a time of need. And then final example on here is the airlines. Obviously, the airlines saw record lows in terms of people traveling, but some of them then were able to say, what's going up is home shipments of products. And so switching many flights to cargo only. Many airlines today are still doing, a portion of their fleet is cargo only. And now they're going to have to make some decisions. Should we shift some of those back? Should we keep some of those? Is that working for us? So just some interesting opportunities that some of those airlines were able to capitalize on. But now they're at an inflection point where they now have to decide, where do we go next? So I don't know how many of you know Japanese, probably not too many, but I thought what was really interesting is that in Japanese, what's on your screen is the word crisis. And you'll see there's two characters there. The first character stands for danger, right? Makes sense, for the word crisis. The second character, though, stands for opportunity. So how telling is that when we think about what's happened over the last year, that the Japanese actually look at the word crisis in two ways. With danger, there always is some opportunity, and that's kind of where I'm going to pivot to next. Is really thinking about how you've heard the term necessity is the mother of invention, and I like Plato. I think was actually kind of the person credited most for that saying. It was more around our need will be the real creator. And it's a true statement that historically catastrophes have often led to periods of rapid change. And so you'll see a quote on here from a fellow from the School of Business, the NYU School of Business, that it's very common throughout history that a crises can really be catalysts to take a good idea that had been out there and really accelerate it into the marketplace. So a couple quick examples there. The cholera epidemic in London really is credited with what led to modern day sewer systems. So it's not that there weren't people thinking about sewer systems back at that time, but when there's an epidemic around, it really forces people to move. And that really was an accelerant in London to get that moving. And then that obviously, cascaded around the world to big cities and into our homes in the future. Similarly, in 1918 was the flu pandemic. And that was kind of a time that was credited to really kind of the modern look at how healthcare is managed. So prior to that, the average person in the population didn't really have access to healthcare. Coming out of that, that's what really a lot of the, very different, from the US and different parts of the world, but really expanding access to the average person to modern day healthcare really was driven out of that pandemic. Now you can look at the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic and where we're at today and say, well, what are going to be those things coming out of what we just experienced that may accelerate things as we move into the future? A couple examples I put down, and there's probably several more. The first one is remote working. Here I sit in my home office, have spent the better part of the last 15 months working from home, and probably will continue to do some level of working from home in the future. And I think many of you may be in that same situation. So that is something that I think, yes, many people did remote working before, but moving forward, I think people are going to look at what happened with the pandemic and say, yeah, this was the catalyst to really kind of push people and push the limits as to what really is possible. Another good example is just the way the vaccines were developed. And so a lot of people will say, how is it possible to develop vaccines in such a short period of time, when historically, prior to that, it often took many, many years to develop vaccines? And I'm certainly no expert on this, but there was a new technology that really is behind how many of the vaccines were developed so quickly, and it's called messenger RNA vaccines. And so do you think that's a one-time thing? Absolutely not. If now we've proven and over time continue to prove that these vaccines were successful, it bodes well, right, for the future of vaccines and the ability to actually deal with other viruses moving forward. So that's just a couple examples, but necessity is the mother of invention. How do you capitalize on a crisis? Well, it's not always about turning it into economic benefit. That is a piece of it, but it also is a good inflection point for every one of our companies to look and say, what has just happened and how do I really think about my vision and where I'm moving in the future? Because it's going to be critical as we come out of the events of the past 2 years. So let's talk a little bit about the pace of change. So it's a lot of people talk about, oh my gosh, that change is happening faster than it's ever happened before, and it's continuing to accelerate. And that's a true statement. What this graphic I have on the screen, I think many of you may have seen before, but I find it a really good example where that this talks about is how long did it take for different industries and different products to reach 50 million users. And so on the outside, it shows, the first example is airlines. It took roughly 68 years before airlines were being used by more than 50 million people. And then as you go down to automobiles and telephones and electricity, you'll see that cycle time got less and less and less. And if you look over the last decade, it's gotten, even faster, right? So Facebook took 3 years. WeChat, which is the messaging platform largely in China, 1 year. And the big one here now is Pokemon Go from a few years ago, hit 50 million users in 19 days. So yes, I think you could argue that a software product can get much more broad adoption a lot faster than a product like airlines. But the point is, the internet, the ability to develop software, that's the reality today. So clearly we can't develop new products that are going to take 68 years to get into to that type of a user base. And so clearly the pace of change is accelerating. Having said that, though, the pace of change isn't constant. The change is constant, but the pace of it is not. And so I think you hear a lot of people talking about that change is linear, it's exponential, and that's actually not true. There's a lot of research out there that I read through as I was preparing for this that actually proved that out. And the best thing I found is this chart I have on the right, which was from an article done for the World Economic Forum. And a lot of this came from a handful of experts in their fields, including someone from Oxford. And they describe it that change is in kind of industry is more accurately modeled as S curves, right? Where there's periods of time where there is rapid acceleration, but generally, and almost in every case, at some point, then it flattens back out. Or maybe it's called a pause, where it went from rapid change to light change or kind of a plateau. And then at some point, there's something else happens. Some other thing comes along, and that's probably still overlapping a period of a pause, and then accelerates again. And so think about this in changes over time, that it's a series of rapid acceleration followed by some pauses and so on and so on. And what I found super interesting is that some of the most important developments in human history happened during the pauses, right? So if you think about, kind of what I said earlier about, having to move from strategy to tactics, right? Some of those tactics, it's quick adoption of things, but coming out of those massive periods of change, that's when the real innovation then kicks in, where people look at what happened and where those markets are at and what their customers are saying. And they say, well, now is the time to use those as catalysts to move forward in a different way. Some examples of those are nuclear energy, television, air conditioning. Those are all examples of coming out of some crisis where then, as we hit a pause, those things really then became much more mainstream. An example that Chris McKenna from Oxford called out was robotic technology. Robotics clearly is becoming more and more part of everything we do today, but there's a strong belief that sometime in the next 30 years, there's going to be something that occurs that really is going to become, again, that catalyst to accelerate that faster than the growth curve it's been on. Certainly there's been some of that over the past several years, especially in terms of automation of assembly lines and things like that. But that, it's really taking that to the next level. When you think about what you see in movies today, some of that will come true. What is that next major event that's coming along that's going to, kind of really be that catalyst to move it forward? So what I encourage you to think about is, what is, when are we going to return to normal? What does normal look like? Are we going to be moving into a pause period? And is that in 2021? Is that in 2022? When will that occur next? The best resource I found to think about this actually is this diagram. So I'd be remiss not to say that this is actually an output from the Columbia Threadneedle, which is affiliated and is part of Ameriprise Financial, where I work. But it is probably the best thing I've seen out there, which they've created a composite index around many, many different, facets of life. So not just the economy, but just different things. And they've been producing this for a little while now. And this was published as of May 1st. I'll have to go check if they've updated it yet. But if you look back on February 1st, they said they believe, based on the research they've done, we're about at 58% back to normal. As of May 1st, it was already up to 72%. I know in my day-to-day life, I'm feeling that as well. This past weekend, as an example, I went up to my cabin. I went to some stores. It felt kind of normal. Now, when I went into the stores, half the shelves were still empty, right? So clearly we're not there yet. And I think some companies are still struggling to kind of get back to some level of normalcy. But hey, if this continues, I think we're going to get closer and closer to normal, whatever that is, much more quickly than a lot of people were probably originally thinking. So again, back to what I showed you previously, think about when, for you, in what you do in your companies, when are we going to be coming out of a kind of that acceleration of growth? When are we going to be moving back into that pause? Think about all of the strategy that got put on hold. Think of all the tactics that were put in place. And now, if any level of pause is coming, what do you do next, right? That is really where we're going to spend the rest of the time today together, talking about some of the tools in your toolbox as a business architect that you can use really to address that. And if you're still in a rapid period of growth, accelerate, or if you're thinking about coming into a pause, how you can accelerate kind of some of your agendas to move forward. So with that, let's take a brief pause. And Beth, were there any questions that came through on the chat that we should address midway through the presentation today?
Not yet, but I will remind people that they can send their question just to panelists. So if they're a little shy and don't want everyone to see who's asking the question, they can kind of do it incognito. And so I'll give people a minute to type. While they're doing that, I'm going to clarify that I am technically on vacation this week. So while I am in my basement installing flooring, it's not on taxpayer dollar time. I am I'm on vacation. And Dean, I also like that you mentioned Plato. I feel like Plato's statement makes him the original business architect, right? Like business should focus on a need.
I think we need to run with that. I like that actually a lot.
That's our next course, business based on Greek philosophy. That'll be business architecture and Greek philosophy. So, yeah. And then I'll just say too, the pause has given me pause to think about, because we've tried to do the virtual biz art class for, I don't know, 3 years maybe, with stops and starts and no momentum, get interrupted. And now we'll do it in about 6 months here during the pandemic. So while we're in the pause, but we look forward to seeing people in person again in the fall and in the spring. So I didn't see anything come through, so keep on going, Dean.
All right, so let's dive into the fun part. So as business architects, what do we need to do? We need to adapt, right? And that's what we're going to cover next is kind of a series of kind of tips and tricks and ideas that I've got that I've used in my personal life, in my career, as well as some things I found in researching for this. So hopefully you find them helpful. One of the slides I always like to lead in with is this one. I used this in my last webinar as well, which is when people ask me, Dean, what is a business architect? Because nobody still knows what it actually is. I always talk about, well, to me, it's rather simple. It's all about aligning strategic objectives and technical demands. And when I say that, I'm like, isn't that what we just talked about for the last 20 minutes? And that's exactly right. So when you think about those S curves I was showing you in periods of change and acceleration of change and back to pauses, what better career to have than to be a business architect that can help the companies you're working for help navigate those uncertain times, going into them, coming back out of them, and really inform critical decision making. And for us, we just, I think, need to get better, right, at being to adapt ourselves. So I think sometimes we try to apply the same methods the same way, to different problems, whether you're on that acceleration path or not. And so, the solution to every problem isn't doing a capability assessment, right? It could be to do a rapid capability assessment in a very small way. But I think what we'll talk a lot about is that need for speed. How do we hit that turbo button when we need to? And take the lessons of the last year as well as what we've been doing as business architects for the last 10 years and kind of marry those things together in different ways to help our companies navigate through these periods of change. So tip number one is to act like a startup. Easier said than done, but startups have a lot of advantages, and we're just going to sit back a little bit and think about what are those attributes of a startup that we, especially coming out of something like we just went through, need to kind of really think about helping just ourselves, but our companies to really be able to move faster. And the first one is we need to stick to what we're good at, which is to help push towards a vision. We need to think big. In my day job a couple of weeks ago, it was super exciting because we actually had someone in our business step up and say, you know what, maybe we need to rethink about this whole new thing that we've never talked about doing, but now we're seeing kind of an interest in the marketplace for, we've never really talked about it, but we don't think anyone's doing that. Why not put that out there as kind of a stretch for us? Let's get some folks together and really let's push for something, bigger than what we've thought about before. So whatever your vision was a year ago probably needs to be retooled and rethought about to take into account everything you've heard about and really kind of put the, do the outside of the box thinking, as they say, think big, think of what you're hearing and maybe where you could take your company differently. But start small, right? I mean, why are startups successful? And the reason they're successful when they are is because they start small and they stay extremely focused. You don't see startups who try to tackle 25 things at the same time. So they have big visions, but they're very focused. They're in one area that they can excel at, where they can, do their customer research. They can, iterate. They can get feedback. So yes, think big, but take the best ideas. Think small, run with those, and move forward with them. Risk taking, I think, is always one of the big things I think of when I think of a startup. It's not a startup if there's no risks, right? You wouldn't be even doing it if it was that easy, because there'd be other market entrants who had already tackled that. And so again, coming out of what we saw over the last year, now is the time to really think about, what are those big things? Where should I focus my time? But I also have to be willing to take risks. That may mean, asking your company for some funding to say, here's my next great idea I have. We're going to need to take some risks and try this out, but no risk, no reward, as they say. And so if you're not willing to take any risks, you're not going to become a first entrant. You're not going to be that fast follower. You're going to fall behind because there's plenty of other people out in industry who are willing to take those risks. Another really, really big one is to know your customer. And that's easy to say, right? I think, customer centricity is certainly a big area for business architects and many of the folks we work with. But what I'd like to do is suggest you think about it a little bit differently. So it's not just knowing who your customers are and what they do. So I think that's where we spend a lot of time, right? I can label who my customers are, rattle them off top 1 through 10. I have a general idea of what they do. So I'll use an example, right? So again, my wife and I run a small business. It's called MindStart. We develop products for people with dementia, so memory loss. And one of the biggest products we sell is puzzles that have been adapted for people who just can't, without memory, sometimes it's really hard to set a basic puzzle. And so for over 10 years now, we've been custom designing puzzles and selling them. I can rattle off who my top resellers are, in addition to kind of the digital chain where we sell things online. But in terms of what they actually need, that becomes a little bit harder, right? So over the last year, some of you may know, but puzzles went through the roof, right? And we actually sold out very quickly on many of the SKUs we sell. We also found it very hard to find suppliers to continue to manufacture them for us. In fact, some of the big players have taken up all of the execution capacity of many of the puzzle manufacturers, and we're currently struggling to find where we're going to go next with that. And so, we're really kind of faced with where do we go next? We were a startup, let's call it 12 years ago. We almost have to rethink a little bit of what our business model is. We need to go back to some of our major resellers and say, what is it that you actually need? It's not just reselling a product. We need to dig a little bit deeper into why are people going to them to buy our products. And so digging that deep, look behind kind of who your customer is super important. I'll also mention, for those of you who are familiar with the jobs to be done framework, if you're not, become familiar with it. I find myself over and over again referring to it because I think in this example, again, you need to know what jobs your clients and your customers are trying to get done. If you just know what they're doing with your product today and that they buy it, that's not enough, because if someone comes along and offers them a better way to get the core job they need done at a cheaper rate than you're providing, you're going to lose that client. If you continue to know and understand what jobs they're trying to accomplish and can continue to co-innovate with them on new solutions to help them with those jobs, that's how you become that vested partner with them that they're going to stick around with. So know your customer in a much deeper way than you may know today. Another one is to be persistent. And as business architects, hopefully you know this one well. Get used to hearing no to your ideas. Quite often you have to go back once, twice, 3 times, 5 times, 7 times. But again, startups are really good at this, right? They don't take no for an answer. They keep pushing. They just keep pushing. And they have to know. You do need to know where to cut your losses, but you also need to know that nothing's easy, right? So be persistent. Continue to push. So that you can get your ideas sold and move in kind of into that next phase. So I talked a lot about customers already, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper here. So I think kind of if there's one takeaway from today, it's probably going to be what I'm sharing with you on this slide, which is to rethink your customer journeys. So 2020 certainly has taught us that customers' expectations have changed. And so customers now commonly expect things that they may not have expected a year ago. So the first one is online experiences that are on par with in-person experiences, right? And I think we all live this in our day-to-day lives over the past year. A really good example of this, I've faced many times over the last year, right? If I go to a store, I can go to a shelf, I can find a product. If it's there, I grab it, I can go buy it. How many times have you gone online and said, I need something, but I need to find a store where it's at? That's not that easy, right? If you're gonna order it, maybe, right? And so we've come to expect, the Amazon experience of going on there, finding a product, finding different ways to buy it through Amazon, and being able to have it shipped to your house. Well, what about Dean's example of not being ready for Christmas on Christmas shopping? And it's 2 days before. I've missed the window of Amazon shipping, and I need to find something, or Christmas morning is going to be a disaster. So I have a product in mind. I randomly go to a website. I search. I find it on their digital marketplace. Then I say, what store do you have it in? Well, some people were really, really lousy at this a year ago. I'll say many of them have gotten a lot better. But back then, if you're lucky, maybe it'll show you here's 3 stores. Well, then let's marry that with kind of the next piece, which is I want to go pick it up later today, and I want it a touchless delivery where it's brought out and dropped in the trunk of my car. Well, many websites, even today, you try to do those sequence of steps, and you're going to hit the wall. And all of a sudden, you find that, okay, I have a product in my cart, but if I go to that store, they don't offer it as a touchless delivery. And so, there's just a level of customer expectation. None of that existed, right, over a year ago. And so those are things many customers are now more commonly expecting. I already mentioned contactless options. I don't know about you, but I've really gotten used to the ability to, create a shopping list online, schedule a delivery, show up, have them come out and put it in the back of my car. Even if companies move to, and some of them have moved to having to pay for that, I'm probably still in certain circumstances going to be willing to pay for that. Think about the example of families that have small children where they don't want to bring them into the store. Good option to be able to do that curbside pickup, have people bring it out for you. That again, that is something that is much bigger and will be bigger moving forward than it was in the past. Anytime, anywhere access. Obviously, we were on a path to that in the past, but that's obviously going to continue to grow over the coming years. So the ability in the middle of the night to add to your shopping order so that you can pick it up the next morning, doing it from any type of mobile device, and it works, right, just like it does on the web experience. Higher expectations than in the past. Customer service. There's a lot of research out there that says customer service expectations have grown tremendously, especially when it comes to digital. So an example I can give here is a couple months ago, I decided I don't have the luxury of being able to cut the cord yet for to full streaming, but I did want to switch to a different dish provider. And so I'm like, this should be easy, right? I go online, I go to their website, I sign up, I place the order. Pretty cool. They allowed me to schedule an installation coming up in the next week. I'm set. So sure enough, that time comes and goes. I'm sitting here waiting for it, 4-hour window, and nobody shows up. I'm like, well, this is great. Well, then I do get a phone call and they say, sorry, we don't have someone available, but we do have someone available, but not for another week. So disappointed, not happy about it, but I'm like, okay, that's fine. So we schedule it the next week. Well, you know where this is going, right? Sure enough, the next week comes, nobody shows up. Again, this time I get no phone call. So the next day I call in to their help desk. They look and they say, sorry, we don't even see any reference to your order. I'm like, well, this is great. So I yell a little bit and they escalate. Finally, after a half hour, they find someone who finds what happened. They find my order. Apparently, they had scheduled it for the year 2035. Don't know how that can happen, but they fixed it. And they said, all right, we'll get someone to call you back and then try to get someone out there in the next 2 days. Well, guess where it's going? Nobody calls me back. I call back in. 2 phone calls later over 2 days, they totally lost my order. They could never find it again. I gave up. Well, guess what? I'm not going back to that company, right? I'm not going to, give them my money after that experience. And so, customer service, higher expectations. A lot of companies are really looking at how do I invest in better customer service, especially through phone and digital channels in particular. Another one on here is end-to-end offerings and connected journeys. And so what I mean by this is that we've come to expect, that a one-stop shop, the ability to go one place, your initial touch point all the way through it being fulfilled or, installed, that it all works and that I don't have to get involved. I don't need to call other people, right? So a good example of this is I need some work done on my deck. And it's going to involve 3 different types of contractors. And so the first company I called was able to do 2 parts of that. But they said, you know what, we don't have any carpenters available. So we're happy to help you, but you're going to have to find your own carpenter. Well, sure enough, good luck trying to find a carpenter. I called a number of people. Nobody's called me back. So I'm a little bit stuck. I found another company who said, oh, yeah, we can do it all for you. So we'll be out in the next week. We'll give you a quote. And even if we need to subcontract some of the work out, we'll take care of all that for you, make sure all the invoicing happens and it works. Well, guess where I'm going, right? I don't even almost care what the cost is. If it's anywhere close, I'm going with that offering. So even in the B2B world, you get this, right? You don't want to get 4 different invoices from 4 different departments. It's kind of an expectation, and even more so over the last year, that one-stop shop mentality is here to stay. The final one I've got on this list is ultra personalization. We've come to expect that when I go to a website, it knows me, it knows what I want, and then I can personalize things. Example here, I love eBay. It's one of my favorite apps. And so they've gotten better and better at me being able to say, when I go to eBay, it shows me what I need. It sorts things the way I want to sort them. That level of personalization, you need to be thinking about how you do that on your own websites and in the own applications you've got, because people are going to come to expect what they're seeing from some of those really, really good digital companies out there. And so I think where this goes next for you is it's time to re-energize your customer journey mapping efforts. So I think hopefully most of you have used customer journey mapping. It's not new, it's been around for a while. Business architects quite often are involved in customer journey mapping, either through leading it or participating in it. And so it's definitely a turning point for your customer journey maps, because whatever you built last year probably doesn't apply for this year and moving forward, because your customer expectations have changed. So just a brief little bit of segue on customer journey maps. A couple examples, you can find plenty of these online, but it's just a visual representation of all of the touch points that your customer has as they engage with your brand. And so it typically includes a timeline, all the different touch points, but the real magic comes with the sentiments, the pain points, kind of what your customer experiences are as they go through those different parts of the timeline. So I think three important modern trends to think about. So in addition to kind of reacting to what I shared with you on the last slide, all these different changing things that are happening with your customer expectations, 3 trends that I saw out there that I think are worth calling out. The first one is integration of voice of the customer. And so most companies have voice of the customer programs. They maybe they're run out of your service desks, maybe they're run out of your marketing group, wherever they're run out. They tend to have really good processes for going out on a regular basis and soliciting feedback, real feedback from a broad subset of your clients, and quite often producing really good reports and information about what is the customer saying. Well, if you think about that, and then you think about building customer journey maps, you're like, well, shouldn't those be related? And the answer is, yeah, they probably should be. And so as my second bullet says, quite often customer journey maps, in my experience, are developed as part of projects, right? You're on a project, you need to kind of know what the customer thinks, you build some journey maps, it helps you build a product, get it out the door, and then quite often those journey maps might just slowly die on the shelf, or maybe some group is responsible for kind of incrementally updating them. But why wouldn't you want to keep those updated? Especially if you already have this conduit of data coming through the voice of the customer program. I think that's a really interesting trend to think about, how you can reach out to that team and start to kind of inject what they're already doing into your customer journey mapping, especially if we're moving into a pause where it's super critical that you kind of reflect on the changes in customer experience expectations over the past year. The final one is just to make sure you're leveraging an unbiased third party. No matter what you do, if you do it all with internal resources within one team, there's going to be some level of bias that comes out in this. And so I'm not an advocate of going out and hiring a big third-party firm to do this for you, but I will say having at least someone outside of your team, maybe from the voice of the customer program, maybe from marketing, maybe from some other walk of life, or maybe a third-party firm, is, I think, super useful to make sure that you don't overly focus in the wrong spaces, that as you're reviewing what your customers are saying, you're not biased in kind of how you're incorporating that in, because it's super critical that you get that right, because that is, again, how you're going to prioritize where you move with the products that you're developing as you move forward. Tip number 3 is that Agile isn't just for development. And now is the time, if you haven't already done this, to really push for developing an Agile operating model more broadly in your organization. And yes, that means with the business. So I think a good resource that you can use is shown a little bit on the right. There's a good article out there that was co-done by McKinsey and the Harvard Business School that literally, kind of interviewed a lot of companies and a lot of business lines within companies, and it basically proved out what you'd expect. Companies that had agile transformations pre-COVID performed much better throughout the pandemic, and believe they're in a better position post-pandemic to keep going. And so, they not only perform better, but significantly better, right? So now is the time to talk to the right people in your organization around how do we take those same concepts that maybe your IT organization has done in pockets and bring that throughout the rest of the organization. And the key ones you already know, right? That customer centricity I've been talking about, product orientation, streamlining decision making by empowering the people at the level that get the work done, and then also reconsider budgeting cycles. If your budget cycles are still, once per year you have an opportunity and you have to plan for them a year in advance, clearly that is not fast enough to be able to react to kind of the swings that are happening in modern day times, as we were just talking about. So I think this is a really, really big one. Hopefully there's conversations happening at your company already. Tip number 4 is to stay out of the rabbit hole. And so I love this saying because I think it's a bad trait of many business architects is just overanalyzing things. And so the idea here is to just really remember that your goal isn't to deliver that great spreadsheet that you're working on or that great presentation you're tuning, but in the end, it's to deliver business value. And so only do as much as you need to be able to sell what you need to sell. And that really comes down to prioritizing. So if you're doing a capability assessment, I rarely think it's valuable to do a capability assessment refresh of every capability. Prioritize down to the critical few capabilities that really are important to deliver on your strategy. So stay focused. And then the other big one here is to get as quickly as possible to that cycle of being able to iterate, where you can start experimenting and then learning and adapting. So again, if you spend 6 months analyzing, you've already missed it, right? Spend a much smaller time, get to something a little more concise, and then start building experiments around it so you can start iterating and getting much closer to something that you can then productize and move forward with. Quick call out for those of you who don't do design sprints, they're a game changer, right? So if you're not familiar with those, Google design sprints, it's a thing that Google kind of launched a while ago. Many companies have adapted or adopted within their organizations, but it's a way in less than a week to take a problem and come up with some really good ideas, get something down on paper with a semi-working prototype, and be able to get your executives on board a lot faster. So it's a great tip to really accelerate things and move forward faster. All right, and my last tip is to really kind of get back to that understanding of changing habits. So I've talked a lot about customer expectations, but this is I thought was super interesting. And again, coming out of kind of where we've been at with COVID is there's just different habits that may be here to stay. And so this again is a article that's quoted in the content here from Harvard Business Review, but it gives you 2 really simple tools that you can use. And the first one, it's just a simple way to look at a change in habit, and then kind of quickly build a hierarchy on what does it mean in terms of how your user base is going to how you as a company are going to be impacted by changes that your clients are doing. And so just one quick example from here is let's go with entertainment. So what this is saying is, early on last March, we all knew that we're all going to be spending more time at home. And so, one of the things we probably could have identified early on is, well, that means much more entertainment is going to be done at home. And so that means, things that are live, guess what? It's exactly what we saw. Those are going to be being put on hold. Well, knowing that there's going to be in-home entertainment, acceleration, well, some of that's digital, some of that's physical. Well, look at this, puzzles, right? I already called that out. We didn't really think about that. I think if we would have done an exercise like this, maybe we could have predicted that a little bit sooner. Digital streaming, I think, again, many companies may have done something like this to see that coming. So super easy exercise that just boil a basic concept like a change in habit and break it down into some things that now are much more tangible that you can look to prepare much more quickly for what might be coming. The other interesting tool that I think is quite useful is how to categorize some of these things. And this really is a spectrum of how many of these things that we're seeing here are new trends versus existing trends? And on the other spectrum, how many of these do we think are temporary versus structural and things that are going to last? The puzzle example I can speak to, which is we believe that's a temporary shift. So there's some displacement of activity, people being at home, can't go out, puzzles are going to go up. But we probably would agree that that's probably going to come back down. So we probably shouldn't go and just add tons of capacity for puzzles when we think sometime over the next year that's probably going to come back down. So that's one way you can think about prioritizing your investments. But you can also see things that like streaming platforms, that was an existing trend, but we know that's not going to go back down. It's only going to see increased utilization. And so therefore, that was a catalyst of what we saw over the last year. And so investments need to continue to be made. So a good little set of quadrants that you can use, good kind of thing that business architects, I think, can use in their day-to-day practice. So suggest you take a look at that and add that to your toolbox. All right, so to kind of close this out, now is the time to build for speed. Whether you agree or not that we're coming out of kind of one of those periods of acceleration into a pause, or maybe that pause is a little bit further away, just recognize that doing nothing is not an effective strategy. Not all things are going to go back to the way they are based on a lot of those changes that I showed you earlier on in the presentation. A couple other things to think about is diversity of talent is a key part of better decision making. So as you're looking at your team structures, how you do the work you do, diversity of talent, there's tons of research to support that supports better decision making, which leads to an increase in speed of being able to deliver. Remember that the fastest path to value can sometimes trump good architecture. A lot of business architects were put in a role of this last year where a lot of the things they wanted to do, we just didn't have the time to do it. So bring some of those things back out, but also just remember that tactics sometimes are required to keep moving through those periods of rapid change. And then finally, I think about how your businesses actually do business strategy development. The days of spending months and months with consultants in rooms, pulling research and data, building presentations, doing countless reviews, followed by steering committees, that just isn't effective anymore. So it gets back to, everything I'm talking about with speed are super important that your executives and the people who are doing strategic planning or organization understand they need to move that faster. And business architects, I think, can absolutely play a critical role in doing that. So think about, how are you going to use your next pause? How can you use the tools in your toolbox, some of the tips and tricks I just talked about, to be able to handle and hopefully do a better job moving forward as we move into whatever the future holds for us. So I know we are running short on time, but I can just, in the last few seconds, there is one question that I saw come through that I can address briefly, which is, the age-old question.
Yep. What tools do you use for prioritization, Dean?
Yeah, so great question. I think there's a ton of tools in standard business architecture that can help you with that. But a lot of this comes back to what is the strategy, right? So in a lot of business architecture, we talk about, mapping your strategies, mapping those to capabilities, prioritizing which of those are most effective in being able to deliver that strategy. I think all of that stuff, certainly applies here. I think if you think about some of the things I've talked about today, there could be a different lens on that, right? If you look at changing customer expectations, if you start hearing voice of the customer data that starts to tell you that priority is raising, that's all stuff that we as business architects need to help connect some of those dots into some of those planning cycles. So I'll think a little bit more about that. I think that's a great question, maybe a future webinar on different ways to prioritize based on a lot of these changing things in the marketplace we've seen today.
Yep, and even though we're at the end, we'll take another question or two if people have them. Dean, if you want to flip to the last slide while we wait, I will say that while you were talking, I wrote down about 4 more ideas for future webinars. So yeah, we're thinking alike. We're using our pause at IPD, as I stated, to figure out our next steps and what customers need for business architecture education. If you're on this webinar, you are on the list to receive our survey so that we can gather your customer input. And the customer journey map item number two, tip number two that Dean talked about individualization. And I just want to mention, if I was remiss, that we do customize our education options for individual companies. So keep that in mind. I'm looking in the chat. I'm not seeing any final questions. And again, it takes us, 2-3 weeks to get it packaged and posted. But if you didn't catch everything the first time around, we will get it posted on our website so you can view or send someone else to view. Then not seeing any more questions. I'm gonna, once again, thank you, Dean, very much for delivering today. Very thought-provoking. Love the 5 tips. So look forward to hearing more from you and getting you back to teaching or getting you started on teaching for Metro State. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you all.